Chapter 3, Part 1 of The Nigger of the Narcissus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 3 of The Nigger of the Narcissus by Joseph Conrad. Meanwhile the Narcissus, with square yards, ran out of the fair monsoon. She drifted slowly, swinging round and round the compass, through a few days of baffling light airs. Under the patter of short warm showers, grumbling men whirled the heavy yards from side to side. They caught hold of the soaked ropes with groans and sighs, while their officers, sulky and dripping with rainwater, unceasingly ordered them about in wearied voices. During the short respites they looked with disgust into the smarting palms of their stiff hands, and asked one another bitterly, who would be a sailor if he could be a farmer? All the tempers were spoilt, and no man cared what he said. One black night, when the watch, panting in the heat and half drowned with the rain, had been through 4 mortal hours hunted from brace to brace, Belfast declared that he would "chuck the sea forever and go in a steamer." This was excessive, no doubt. Captain Ollistoun, with great self-control, would mutter sadly to Mr. Baker, "It is not so bad, not so bad," when he had managed to shove and dodge and maneuver his smart ship through 60 miles in 24 hours. From the doorstep of the little cabin, Jimmy, chin in hand, watched our distasteful labours with insolent and melancholy eyes. We spoke to him gently, and out of his sight exchanged sour smiles. Then, again, with a fair wind and under a clear sky, the ship went on piling up the south latitude. She passed outside Madagascar and Mauritius without a glimpse of the land. Extra lashings were put on the spare spars. Hatches were looked to. The steward in his leisure moments and with a worried air tried to fit washboards to the cabin doors. Stout canvas was bent with care. Anxious eyes looked to the westward towards the Cape of Storms. The ship began to dip into a southwest swell, and the softly luminous sky of low latitudes took on a harder sheen from day to day above our heads. It arched high above the ship, vibrating and pale, like an immense dome of steel, resonant with the deep voice of freshening gales. The sunshine gleamed cold on the white curls of black waves. Before the strong breath of westerly squalls, the ship, with reduced sails, lay slowly over, obstinate and yielding. She drove to and fro in the unceasing endeavour to fight her way through the invisible violence of the winds. She pitched headlong into dark, smooth hollows. She struggled upwards over the snowy ridges of great running seas. She rolled, restless, from side to side like a thing in pain. Enduring and valiant, she answered to the call of men, and her slim spars, waving forever in abrupt semicircles, seemed to beckon in vain for help towards the stormy sky. It was a bad winter off the Cape that year. The relieved helmsmen came off flapping their arms, or ran stamping hard and blowing into swollen red fingers. The watch on deck dodged the sting of cold sprays, or, crouching in sheltered corners, watched dismally the high and merciless seas boarding the ship time after time in unappeasable fury. Water tumbled in cataracts over the forecastle doors. You had to dash through a waterfall to get into your damp bed. The men turned in wet and turned out stiff to face the redeeming and ruthless exactions of their glorious and obscure fate. Far aft and peering watchfully to windward, the officers could be seen through the mists of squalls. They stood by the weather rail, holding on grimly, straight and glistening in their long coats. And in the disordered plunges of the hard-driven ship, they appeared high up, attentive, tossing violently above the grey line of a clouded horizon in motionless attitudes. They watched the weather and the ship as men on shore watch the momentous chances of fortune. Captain Ollistoun never left the deck, as though he had been part of the ship's fittings. Now and then the steward, shivering, but always in shirt sleeves, would struggle towards him with some hot coffee, half of which the gale blew out of the cup before it reached the master's lips. He drank what was left gravely in one long gulp, while the heavy sprays pattered loudly on his oilskin coat, the seas swishing broke about his high boots, and he never took his eyes off the ship. He kept his gaze riveted upon her as a loving man watches the unselfish toil of a delicate woman, upon the slender thread of whose existence is hung the whole meaning and joy of the world. We all watched her. She was beautiful and had a weakness. We loved her no less for that. We admired her qualities aloud, we boasted of them to one another as though they had been our own, and the consciousness of her only fault we kept buried in the silence of our profound affection. She was born in the thundering peal of hammers beating upon iron, in black eddies of smoke, under a grey sky, on the banks of the Clyde. The clamorous and sombre stream gives birth to things of beauty that float away into the sunshine of the world to be loved by men. The Narcissus was one of that perfect brood. Less perfect than many perhaps, but she was ours, and consequently incomparable. We were proud of her. In Bombay ignorant landlubbers alluded to her as that pretty grey ship. Pretty? A scurvy meed of commendation. We knew she was the most magnificent sea-boat ever launched. We tried to forget that, like many good sea-boats, she was at times rather crank. She was exacting. She wanted care in loading and handling, and no one knew exactly how much care would be enough. Such are the imperfections of mere men. The ship knew, and sometimes would correct the presumptuous human ignorance by the wholesome discipline of fear. We had heard ominous stories about past voyages. The cook, technically a seaman, but in reality no sailor, the cook, when unstrung by some misfortune, such as the rolling over of a saucepan, would mutter gloomily while he wiped the floor, "There, look at what she has done. Some voyage she will drown all hands. You'll see if she won't." To which the steward, snatching in the galley a moment to draw a breath in the hurry of his worried life, would remark philosophically, "Those that see won't tell, anyhow. I don't want to see it." We derided those fears. Our hearts went out to the old man when he pressed her hard so as to make her hold her own, hold to every inch gained to windward, when he made her, under reefed sails, leap obliquely at enormous waves. The men, knitted together aft into a ready group by the first sharp order of an officer coming to take charge of the deck in bad weather, "Keep handy the watch," stood admiring her valiance. Their eyes blinked in the wind, their dark faces were wet with drops of water more salt and bitter than human tears, beards and moustaches soaked, hung straight and dripping like fine seaweed. They were fantastically misshapen, in high boots, in hats like helmets, and swaying clumsily, stiff and bulky in glistening oilskins. They resembled men strangely equipped for some fabulous adventure. Whenever she rose easily to a towering green sea, elbows dug ribs, faces brightened, lips murmured, "Didn't she do it cleverly?" and all the hands turning like one watching with sardonic grins the foiled wave go roaring to leeward, white with the foam of a monstrous rage. But when she had not been quick enough, and struck heavily, lay over trembling under the blow, we clutched at ropes, and looking up at the narrow bands of drenched and strained sails waving desperately aloft, we thought in our hearts, "No wonder, poor thing." The 32nd day out of Bombay began inauspiciously. In the morning a sea smashed one of the galley doors. We dashed in through lots of steam and found the cook very wet and indignant with the ship. "She's getting worse every day. She's trying to drown me in front of my own stove." He was very angry. We pacified him, and the carpenter, though washed away twice from there, managed to repair the door. Through that accident our dinner was not ready till late, but it didn't matter in the end because Knowles, who went to fetch it, got knocked down by a sea and the dinner went over the side. Captain Allistoun, looking more hard and thin-lipped than ever, hung on to full topsails and foresail, and would not notice that the ship, asked to do too much, appeared to lose heart altogether for the first time since we knew her. She refused to rise, and bored her way sullenly through the seas. Twice running, as though she had been blind or weary of life, she put her nose deliberately into a big wave and swept the decks from end to end. As the boatswain observed with marked annoyance, while we were splashing about in a body to try and save a worthless wash-tub, "Every bloomin' thing in the ship is going overboard this afternoon." Venerable Singleton broke his habitual silence and said with a glance aloft, "The old man's in a temper with the weather, but it's no good being angry with the winds of heaven." Jimmy had shut his door, of course. We knew he was dry and comfortable within his little cabin, and in our absurd way were pleased one moment, exasperated the next, by that certitude. Donkin skulked shamelessly, uneasy and miserable. He grumbled, "I'm perishin' with cold outside in bloomin' wet rags, and that 'ere black soldier sits dry on a blamed chest full of bloomin' clothes, blank his black soul." We took no notice of him. We hardly gave a thought to Jimmy and his bosom friend. There was no leisure for idle probing of hearts. Sails blew adrift. Things broke loose. Cold and wet, we were washed about the deck while trying to repair damages. The ship tossed about, shaken furiously like a toy in the hands of a lunatic. Just at sunset there was a rush to shorten sail before the menace of a sombre hail cloud. The hard gust of wind came brutal like the blow of a fist. The ship, relieved of her canvas in time, received it pluckily. She yielded reluctantly to the violent onset, then coming up with a stately and irresistible motion, brought her spars to windward in the teeth of the screeching squall. Out of the abysmal darkness of the black cloud overhead, white hail streamed on her, rattled on the rigging, leaped in handfuls off the yards, rebounded on the deck, round and gleaming in the murky turmoil like a shower of pearls. It passed away. For a moment a livid sun shot horizontally the last rays of sinister light between the hills of steep, rolling waves. Then a wild night rushed in, stamped out in a great howl that dismal remnant of a stormy day. There was no sleep on board that night. Most seamen remember in their life one or two such nights of a culminating gale. Nothing seems left to the whole universe but darkness, clamour, fury, and the ship. And like the last vestige of a shattered creation she drifts, bearing an anguished remnant of sinful mankind through the distress, tumult, and pain of an avenging terror. No one slept in the forecastle. The tin oil lamp, suspended on a long string, smoking, described wide circles. Wet clothing made dark heaps on the glistening floor. A thin layer of water rushed to and fro. In the bed places men lay booted, resting on elbows and with open eyes. Hung-up suits of oilskin swung out and in, lively and disquieting, like reckless ghosts of decapitated seamen dancing in a tempest. No one spoke, and all listened. Outside the night moaned and sobbed to the accompaniment of a continuous loud tremor as of innumerable drums beating far off. Shrieks passed through the air. Tremendous dull blows made the ship tremble while she rolled under the weight of the seas toppling on her deck. At times she soared up swiftly as if to leave this earth forever, then during interminable moments fell through a void with all the hearts on board of her standing still, till a frightful shock, expected and sudden, started them off again with a big thump. After every dislocating jerk of the ship, Wamibo, stretched full length, his face on the pillow, groaned slightly with the pain of his tormented universe. Now and then, for the fraction of an intolerable second, the ship, in fiercer burst of a more terrible uproar, remained on her side, vibrating and still, with a stillness more appalling than the wildest motion. Then upon all those prone bodies a stir would pass, a shiver of suspense. A man would protrude his anxious head, and a pair of eyes glistened in the sway of light, glaring wildly. Some moved their legs a little as if making ready to jump out. But several, motionless on their backs and with one hand gripping hard the edge of the bunk, smoked nervously with quick puffs, staring upwards, immobilized in a great craving for peace. At midnight orders were given to furl the fore and mizzen topsails. With immense efforts men crawled aloft through a merciless buffeting, saved the canvas, and crawled down again almost exhausted, to bear in panting silence the cruel battering of the sea. Perhaps for the first time in the history of the merchant service the watch, told to go below, did not leave the deck, as if compelled to remain there by the fascination of a venomous violence. At every heavy gust men, huddled together, whispered to one another, "It can blow no harder." And presently the gale would give them the lie with a piercing shriek and drive their breath back into their throats. A fierce squall seemed to burst asunder the thick mass of sooty vapors, and above the rack of torn clouds glimpses could be caught of the high moon rushing backwards with frightful speed over the sky, right into the wind's eye. Many hung their heads, muttering that it "turned their innards out" to look at it. Soon the clouds closed up, and the world again became a raging, blind darkness that howled, flinging at the lonely ship salt sprays and sleet. At 7:30 the pitchy obscurity round us turned a ghastly grey, and we knew that the sun had risen. This unnatural and threatening daylight, in which we could see one another's wild eyes and drawn faces, was only an added tax on our endurance. The horizon seemed to have come on all sides within arm's length of the ship. Into that narrowed circle furious seas leaped in, struck, and leaped out. A rain of salt, heavy drops flew aslant like mist. The main topsail had to be goose-winged, and with stolid resignation everyone prepared to go aloft once more, but the officers yelled, pushed back, and at last we understood that no more men would be allowed to go on the yards than were absolutely necessary for the work. As at any moment the masts were likely to be jumped out or blown overboard, we concluded that the captain didn't want to see all his crowd go over the side at once. That was reasonable. The watch then on duty, led by Mr. Crichton, began to struggle up the rigging. The wind flattened them against the ratlines, then, easing a little, would let them ascend a couple of steps, and again, with a sudden gust, pin all up the shrouds, the whole crawling line in attitudes of crucifixion. The other watch plunged down on the main deck to haul up the sail. Men's heads bobbed up as the water flung them irresistibly from side to side. Mr. Baker grunted encouragingly in our midst, spluttering and blowing amongst the tangled ropes like an energetic porpoise. Favoured by an ominous and untrustworthy lull, the work was done without any one being lost either off the deck or from the yard. For the moment the gale seemed to take off, and the ship, as if grateful for our efforts, plucked up heart and made better weather of it. At 8, the men off duty, watching their chance, ran forward over the flooded deck to get some rest. The other half of the crew remained aft for their turn of seeing her through her trouble, as they expressed it. The two mates urged the master to go below. Mr. Baker grunted in his ear, "Ough, surely now. Ough. Confidence in us. Nothing more to do. She must lay it out or go. Ough, ough." Tall young Mr. Crichton smiled down at him cheerfully. "She's as right as a trivet. Take a spell, sir." He looked at them stonily with bloodshot, sleepless eyes. The rims of his eyelids were scarlet, and he moved his jaws unceasingly with a slow effort, as though he had been masticating a lump of india rubber. He shook his head. He repeated, "Never mind me. I must see it out. I must see it out." But he consented to sit down for a moment on the skylight, with his hard face turned unflinchingly to windward. The sea spatted it, and, stoical, it streamed with water as though he had been weeping. On the weather side of the poop the watch, hanging on to the mizzen rigging and to one another, tried to exchange encouraging words. Singleton, at the wheel, yelled out, "Look out for yourselves!" His voice reached them in a warning whisper. They were startled. A big foaming sea came out of the mist. It made for the ship, roaring wildly, and in its rush it looked as mischievous and discomposing as a madman with an axe. One or two, shouting, scrambled up the rigging; most, with a convulsive catch of the breath, held on where they stood. Singleton dug his knees under the wheel box and carefully eased the helm to the headlong pitch of the ship, but without taking his eyes off the coming wave. It towered close to and high, like a wall of green glass topped with snow. The ship rose to it as though she had soared on wings, and for a moment rested poised upon the foaming crest as if she had been a great sea-bird. Before we could draw breath a heavy gust struck her. Another roller took her unfairly under the weather bow. She gave a toppling lurch and filled her decks. Captain Allistoun leaped up and fell. Archie rolled over him, screaming, "She will rise!" She gave another lurch to leeward. The lower dead eyes dipped heavily. The men's feet flew from under them, and they hung kicking above the slanting poop. They could see the ship putting her side in the water, and shouted all together, "She's going!" Forward the forecastle doors flew open, and the watch below were seen leaping out one after another, throwing their arms up, and, falling on hands and knees, scrambled aft on all fours along the high side of the deck, sloping more than the roof of a house. From leeward the seas rose, pursuing them. They looked wretched in a hopeless struggle, like vermin fleeing before a flood. They fought up the weather ladder of the poop one after another, half naked and staring wildly, and as soon as they got up they shot to leeward in clusters, with closed eyes, till they brought up heavily with their ribs against the iron stanchions of the rail. Then, groaning, they rolled in a confused mass. The immense volume of water thrown forward by the last descent of the ship had burst the lee door of the forecastle. They could see their chests, pillows, blankets, clothing come out floating upon the sea. While they struggled back to windward they looked in dismay. The straw beds swam high, the blankets spread out, undulated, while the chests, waterlogged and with a heavy list, pitched heavily like dismasted hulks before they sank. Archie's big coat passed with outspread arms, resembling a drowned seaman floating with his head under water. Men were slipping down while trying to dig their fingers into the planks. Others, jammed in corners, rolled enormous eyes. They all yelled unceasingly, "The masts! Cut! Cut!" A black squall howled low over the ship, that lay on her side with the weather yard arms pointing to the clouds, while the tall masts, inclined nearly to the horizon, seemed to be of an immeasurable length. The carpenter let go his hold, rolled against the skylight, and began to crawl to the cabin entrance, where a big axe was kept ready for just such an emergency. At that moment the topsail sheet parted, the end of the heavy chain racketed aloft, and sparks of red fire streamed down through the flying sprays. The sail flapped once with a jerk that seemed to tear our hearts out through our teeth, and instantly changed into a bunch of fluttering narrow ribbons that tied themselves into knots and became quiet along the yard. Captain Allistoun struggled, managed to stand up with his face near the deck, upon which men swung on the ends of ropes, like nest robbers upon a cliff. One of his feet was on somebody's chest, his face was purple, his lips moved. He yelled also. He yelled, bending down, "No! No!" Mr. Baker, one leg over the binnacle stand, roared out, "Did you say no? Not cut?" He shook his head madly. "No! No!" Between his legs the crawling carpenter heard, collapsed at once, and lay full length in the angle of the skylight. Voices took up the shout, "No! No!" Then all became still. They waited for the ship to turn over altogether and shake them out into the sea, and upon the terrific noise of wind and sea not a murmur of remonstrance came out from those men who each would have given ever so many years of life to see "them damn sticks go overboard." They all believed it was their only chance, but a little, hard-faced man shook his gray head and shouted "No!" without giving them so much as a glance. They were silent and gasped. They gripped rails, they had wound ropes' ends under their arms, they clutched ring-bolts, they crawled in heaps where there was foothold, they held on with both arms, hooked themselves to anything to windward with elbows, with chins, almost with their teeth, and some, unable to crawl away from where they had been flung, felt the seas leap up, striking against their backs as they struggled upwards. Singleton had stuck to the wheel. His hair flew out in the wind, the gale seemed to take its lifelong adversary by the beard and shake his old head. He wouldn't let go, and with his knees forced between the spokes, flew up and down like a man on a bow. As death appeared unready, they began to look about. Donkin, caught by one foot in the loop of some rope, hung, head down, below us, and yelled with his face to the deck, "Cut! Cut!" Two men lowered themselves cautiously to him, others hauled on the rope. They caught him up, shoved him into a safer place, held him. He shouted curses at the master, shook his fist at him with horrible blasphemies, called upon us in filthy words to "cut, don't mind that murdering fool, cut, some of you." One of his rescuers struck him a backhanded blow over the mouth. His head banged on the deck, and he became suddenly very quiet, with a white face, breathing hard, and with a few drops of blood trickling from his cut lip. On the lee side another man could be seen stretched out as if stunned; only the washboard prevented him from going over the side. It was the steward. We had to sling him up like a bale, for he was paralyzed with fright. He had rushed up out of the pantry when he felt the ship go over, and had rolled down helplessly, clutching a china mug. It was not broken. With difficulty we tore it away from him, and when he saw it in our hands he was amazed. "Where did you get that thing?" he kept on asking us in a trembling voice. His shirt was blown to shreds, the ripped sleeves flapped like wings. Two men made him fast, and, doubled over the rope that held him, he resembled a bundle of wet rags. Mr. Baker crawled along the line of men, asking, "Are you all there?" and looking them over. Some blinked vacantly, others shook convulsively. Wamibo's head hung over his breast, and in painful attitudes, cut by lashings, exhausted with clutching, screwed up in corners, they breathed heavily. Their lips twitched, and at every sickening heave of the overturned ship they opened them wide as if to shout. The cook, embracing a wooden stanchion, unconsciously repeated a prayer. In every short interval of the fiendish noises around he could be heard there, without cap or slippers, imploring in that storm the master of our lives not to lead him into temptation. Soon he also became silent. In all that crowd of cold and hungry men waiting wearily for a violent death, not a voice was heard; they were mute, and in sombre thoughtfulness listened to the horrible imprecations of the gale. End of Chapter 3, Part 1. The Nigger of the Narcissus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Nigger of the Narcissus by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 3, Part 2. Hours passed. They were sheltered by the heavy inclination of the ship from the wind that rushed in one long unbroken moan above their heads, but cold rain showers fell at times into the uneasy calm of their refuge. Under the torment of that new infliction a pair of shoulders would writhe a little. Teeth chattered. The sky was clearing, and bright sunshine gleamed over the ship. After every burst of battering seas, vivid and fleeting rainbows arched over the drifting hull in the flick of sprays. The gale was ending in a clear blow, which gleamed and cut like a knife. Between two bearded shellbacks, Charley, fastened with somebody's long muffler to a deck ring-bolt, wept quietly, with rare tears wrung out by bewilderment, cold, hunger, and general misery. One of his neighbors punched him in the ribs, asking roughly, "What's the matter with your cheek? In fine weather there's no holding you, youngster." Turning about with prudence, he worked himself out of his coat and threw it over the boy. The other man closed up, muttering, "'Twill make a bloomin' man of you, sonny." They flung their arms over and pressed against him. Charley drew his feet up and his eyelids dropped. Sighs were heard as men, perceiving that they were not to be drowned in a hurry, tried easier positions. Mr. Creighton, who had hurt his leg, lay amongst us with compressed lips. Some fellows belonging to his watch set about securing him better. Without a word or a glance, he lifted his arms one above another to facilitate the operation, and not a muscle moved in his stern, young face. They asked him with solicitude, "Easier now, sir?" He answered with a curt, "That'll do." He was a hard young officer, but many of his watch used to say they liked him well enough because he had such a gentlemanly way of damming us up and down the deck. Others, unable to discern such fine shades of refinement, respected him for his smartness. For the first time since the ship had gone on her beam ends, Captain Allistoun gave a short glance down at his men. He was almost upright, one foot against the side of the skylight, one knee on the deck, and with the end of the vang round his waist swung back and forth with his gaze fixed ahead, watchful, like a man looking out for a sign. Before his eyes the ship, with half her deck under water, rose and fell on heavy seas that rushed from under her flashing in the cold sunshine. We began to think she was wonderfully buoyant, considering. Confident voices were heard shouting, "She'll do, boys!" Belfast exclaimed with fervour, "I would get a month's pay for a draw at a pipe." One or two, passing dry tongues on their salt lips, muttered something about a drink of water. The cook, as if inspired, scrambled up with his breast against the poop water cask and looked in. There was a little at the bottom. He yelled, waving his arms, and two men began to crawl backwards and forwards with the mug. We had a good mouthful all round. The master shook his head impatiently, refusing. When it came to Charley, one of his neighbors shouted, "That bloomin' boy's asleep." He slept as though he had been dosed with narcotics. They let him be. Singleton held to the wheel with one hand while he drank, bending down to shelter his lips from the wind. Wamibo had to be poked and yelled at before he saw the mug held before his eyes. Knowles said sagaciously, "It's better'n a tot of rum." Mr. Baker grunted, "Thank ye." Mr. Creighton drank and nodded. Donkin gulped greedily, glaring over the rim. Belfast made us laugh when, with grimacing mouth, he shouted, "Pass it this way. We're all teetotalers here." The master, presented with the mug again by a crouching man, who screamed up at him, "We all had a drink, Captain," groped for it without ceasing to look ahead, and handed it back stiffly as though he could not spare half a glance away from the ship. Faces brightened. We shouted to the cook, "Well done, Doctor." He sat to leeward, propped by the water cask, and yelled back abundantly, but the seas were breaking in thunder just then, and we only caught snatches that sounded like "Providence" and "Born Again." He was at his old game of preaching. We made friendly but derisive gestures at him, and from below he lifted one arm, holding on with the other, moved his lips. He beamed up to us, straining his voice, earnest, and ducking his head before the sprays. Suddenly someone cried, "Where's Jimmy?" And we were appalled once more. At the end of the row the boatswain shouted hoarsely, "Has anyone seed him come out?" Voices exclaimed dismally, "Drowned, is he?" "No, in his cabin. Good Lord! Caught like a bloomin' rat in a trap. Couldn't open his door. Aye, she went over too quick and the water jammed it. Poor beggar. No help for him. Let's go and see." "Damn him, who could go?" screamed Donkin. "No one expects you to," growled the man next to him. "You're only a thing." "Is there half a chance to get at him?" inquired 2 or 3 men together. Belfast untied himself with blind impetuosity, and all at once shot down to leeward quicker than a flash of lightning. We shouted all together with dismay, but with his legs overboard he held and yelled for a rope. In our extremity nothing could be terrible, so we judged him funny kicking there and with his scared face. Some one began to laugh, and as if hysterically infected with screaming merriment, all those haggard men went off laughing, wild-eyed, like a lot of maniacs tied up on a wall. Mr. Baker swung off the binnacle stand and tendered him one leg. He scrambled up rather scared, and consigning us with abominable words to the "devil." "You are... oh, you're a foul-mouthed beggar, Craik," grunted Mr. Baker. He answered, stuttering with indignation, "Look at 'em, sor. The dirty bloomin' images, laughin' at a chum going overboard. Call themselves men, too." But from the break of the poop the boatswain called out, "Come along," and Belfast crawled away in a hurry to join him. The 5 men, poised and gazing over the edge of the poop, looked for the best way to get forward. They seemed to hesitate. The others, twisting in their lashings, turning painfully, stared with open lips. Captain Allistoun saw nothing. He seemed with his eyes to hold the ship up in a superhuman concentration of effort. The wind screamed loud in sunshine, columns of spray rose straight up, and in the glitter of rainbows bursting over the trembling hull, the men went over cautiously, disappearing from sight with deliberate movements. They went swinging from belaying pin to cleat above the seas that beat the half-submerged deck. Their toes scraped the planks. Lumps of green cold water toppled over the bulwark and on their heads. They hung for a moment on strained arms, with the breath knocked out of them and with closed eyes, then, letting go with one hand, balanced with lolling heads, trying to grab some rope or stanchion further forward. The long-armed and athletic boatswain swung quickly, gripping things with a fist hard as iron, and remembering suddenly snatches of the last letter from his old woman. Little Belfast scrambled in a rage, spluttering, "Cursed nigger!" Wamibo's tongue hung out with excitement, and Archie, intrepid and calm, watched his chance to move with intelligent coolness. When above the side of the house, they let go one after another, and falling heavily, sprawled, pressing their palms to the smooth teak wood. Round them the backwash of waves seethed white and hissing. All the doors had become trap-doors, of course. The first was the galley door. The galley extended from side to side, and they could hear the sea splashing with hollow noises in there. The next door was that of the carpenter's shop. They lifted it and looked down. The room seemed to have been devastated by an earthquake. Everything in it had tumbled on the bulkhead facing the door, and on the other side of that bulkhead there was Jimmy, dead or alive. The bench, with a half-finished meat safe, saws, chisels, wire rods, axes, crowbars, lay in a heap besprinkled with loose nails. A sharp adze stuck up with a shining edge that gleamed dangerously down there like a wicked smile. The men clung to one another, peering. A sickening, sly lurch of the ship nearly sent them overboard in a body. Belfast howled, "Here goes!" and leaped down. Archie followed cannily, catching at shelves that gave way with him, and eased himself in a great crash of ripped wood. There was hardly room for 3 men to move. and in the sunshiny blue square of the door, the boatswain's face, bearded and dark, Wamibo's face, wild and pale, hung over, watching. Together they shouted, "Jimmy! Jim!" From above the boatswains contributed a deep growl, "You! Wait!" In a pause Belfast entreated, "Jimmy, darlin', are you alive?" The boatswain said, "Again! All together, boys!" All yelled excitedly. Wamibo made noises resembling loud barks. Belfast drummed on the side of the bulkhead with a piece of iron. All ceased suddenly. The sound of screaming and hammering went on thin and distinct, like a solo after a chorus. He was alive. He was screaming and knocking below us with the hurry of a man prematurely shut up in a coffin. We went to work. We attacked with desperation the abominable heap of things heavy, of things sharp, of things clumsy to handle. The boatswain crawled away to find somewhere a flying end of a rope, and Wamibo, held back by shouts, "Don't jump! Don't come in here, muddlehead!" remained glaring above us, all shining eyes, gleaming fangs, tumbled hair, resembling an amazed and half-witted fiend gloating over the extraordinary agitation of the damned. The boatswain adjured us to bear a hand, and a rope descended. We made things fast to it, and they went up spinning, never to be seen by man again. A rage to fling things overboard possessed us. We worked fiercely, cutting our hands and speaking brutally to one another. Jimmy kept up a distracting row. He screamed piercingly, without drawing breath, like a tortured woman. He banged with hands and feet. The agony of his fear wrung our hearts so terribly that we longed to abandon him, to get out of that place deep as a well and swaying like a tree, to get out of his hearing back on the poop where we could wait passively for death in incomparable repose. We shouted to him to "shut up, for God's sake." He redoubled his cries. He must have fancied we could not hear him. Probably he heard his own clamour, but faintly. We could picture him crouching on the edge of the upper berth, letting out with both fists at the wood in the dark, and with his mouth wide open for that unceasing cry. Those were loathsome moments. A cloud driving across the sun would darken the doorway menacingly. Every movement of the ship was pain. We scrambled about with no room to breathe, and felt frightfully sick. The boatswain yelled down at us, "Bear a hand! Bear a hand! We too will be washed away from here directly if you ain't quick." 3 times the sea leaped over the high side and flung bucketfuls of water on our heads. Then Jimmy, startled by the shock, would stop his noise for a moment, waiting for the ship to sink perhaps, and began again distressingly loud, as if invigorated by the gust of fear. At the bottom the nails lay in a layer several inches thick. It was ghastly. Every nail in the world, not driven in firmly somewhere, seemed to have found its way into that carpenter's shop. There they were, of all kinds, the remnants of stores from 7 voyages. Tin tacks, copper tacks, sharp as needles, pump nails with big heads, like tiny iron mushrooms, nails without any heads, horrible, French nails polished and slim. They lay in a solid mass, more inabortable than a hedgehog. We hesitated, yearning for a shovel, while Jimmy below us yelled as though he had been flayed. Groaning, we dug our fingers in, and very much hurt, shook our hands, scattering nails and drops of blood. We passed up our hats full of assorted nails to the boatswain, who, as if performing a mysterious and appeasing rite, cast them wide upon a raging sea. We got to the bulkhead at last. Those were stout planks. She was a ship well finished in every detail, the Narcissus was. They were the stoutest planks ever put into a ship's bulkhead, we thought, and then we perceived that, in our hurry, we had sent all the tools overboard. Absurd little Belfast wanted to break it down with his own weight, and with both feet leaped straight up like a springbok, cursing the Clyde shipwrights for not scamping their work. Incidentally he reviled all North Britain, the rest of the earth, the sea, and all his companions. He swore, as he alighted heavily on his heels, that he would never, never any more associate with any fool that hadn't savvy enough to know his knee from his elbow. He managed by his thumping to scare the last remnant of wits out of Jimmy. We could hear the object of our exasperated solicitude darting to and fro under the planks. He had cracked his voice at last, and could only squeak miserably. His back, or else his head, rubbed the planks, now here, now there, in a puzzling manner. He squeaked as he dodged the invisible blows. It was more heart-rending even than his yells. Suddenly Archie produced a crowbar. He had kept it back, also a small hatchet. We howled with satisfaction. He struck a mighty blow and small chips flew at our eyes. The boatswain above shouted, "Look out! Look out there! Don't kill the man! Easy does it!" Wamibo, maddened with excitement, hung head down and insanely urged us, "Ho! Stroke 'em! Ho! Ho!" We were afraid he would fall in and kill one of us, and hurriedly we entreated the boatswain to shove the blamed Finn overboard. Then, all together, we yelled down at the planks, "Stand from under! Get forward!" and listened. We only heard the deep hum and moan of the wind above us, the mingled roar and hiss of the seas. The ship, as if overcome with despair, wallowed lifelessly, and our heads swam with that unnatural motion. Belfast clamoured, "For the love of God, Jimmy, where are ye? Knock, Jimmy darlint! Knock, you bloody black beast! Knock!" He was as quiet as a dead man inside a grave, and, like men standing above a grave, we were on the verge of tears. But with vexation, the strain, the fatigue, with the great longing to be done with it to get away, and lie down to rest somewhere where we could see our danger and breathe. Archie shouted, "Gimme room!" We crouched behind him, guarding our heads, and he struck time after time in the joint of planks. They cracked. Suddenly the crowbar went halfway in through a splintered oblong hole. It must have missed Jimmy's head by less than an inch. Archie withdrew it quickly, and that infamous nigger rushed at the hole, put his lips to it, and whispered, "Help," in an almost extinct voice. He pressed his head to it, trying madly to get out through that opening 1 inch wide and 3 inches long. In our disturbed state we were absolutely paralyzed by his incredible action. It seemed impossible to drive him away. Even Archie at last lost his composure. "If ye don't clear oot I'll drive the crowbar through your head," he shouted in a determined voice. He meant what he said, and his earnestness seemed to make an impression on Jimmy. He disappeared suddenly, and we sat to prising and tearing at the planks with the eagerness of men trying to get at a mortal enemy, and spurred by the desire to tear him limb from limb. The wood split, cracked, gave way. Belfast plunged in head and shoulders and groped viciously. "I've got him! Got him!" he shouted. "Oh, there, he's gone! I've got him! Pull at my legs! Pull!" Wamibo hooted unceasingly. The boatswain shouted directions. "Catch hold of his hair, Belfast! Pull straight up, you two! Pull fair!" We pulled fair. We pulled Belfast out with a jerk and dropped him with disgust. In a sitting posture, purple-faced, he sobbed despairingly, "How can I hold on to his bloomin' short wool?" Suddenly Jimmy's head and shoulders appeared. He stuck halfway and with rolling eyes foamed at our feet. We flew at him with brutal impatience, we tore the shirt off his back, we tugged at his ears, we panted over him, and all at once he came away in our hands as though somebody had let go his legs. With the same movement, without a pause, we swung him up. His breath whistled, he kicked our upturned faces, he grasped 2 pairs of arms above his head, and he squirmed up with such precipitation that he seemed positively to escape from our hands like a bladder full of gas. Streaming with perspiration, we swarmed up the rope, and, coming into the blast of cold wind, gasped like men plunged into icy water. With burning faces we shivered to the very marrow of our bones. Never before had the gale seemed to us more furious, the sea more mad, the sunshine more merciless and mocking, and the position of the ship more hopeless and appalling. Every movement of her was ominous of the end of her agony and of the beginning of ours. We staggered away from the door, and, alarmed by a sudden roll, fell down in a bunch. It appeared to us that the side of the house was more smooth than glass and more slippery than ice. There was nothing to hang on to but a long brass hook used sometimes to keep back an open door. Wamibo held on to it, and we held on to Wamibo, clutching our Jimmy. He had completely collapsed now. He did not seem to have the strength to close his hand. We stuck to him blindly in our fear. We were not afraid of Wamibo letting go. We remembered that the brute was stronger than any 3 men in the ship. But we were afraid of the hook giving way, and we also believed that the ship had made up her mind to turn over at last. But she didn't. A sea swept over us. The boatswain spluttered, "Up and away, there's a lull. Away aft with you, or we will all go to the devil here." We stood up, surrounding Jimmy. We begged him to hold up, to hold on at least. He glared with his bulging eyes, mute as a fish, and with all the stiffening knocked out of him. He wouldn't stand, he wouldn't even as much as clutch at our necks. He was only a cold black skin loosely stuffed with soft cotton wool. His arms and legs swung jointless and pliable. His head rolled about. The lower lip hung down, enormous and heavy. We pressed round him, bothered and dismayed. Sheltering him, we swung here and there in a body, and on the very brink of eternity we tottered all together with concealing and absurd gestures, like a lot of drunken men embarrassed with a stolen corpse. Something had to be done. We had to get him aft. A rope was tied slack under his armpits, and, reaching up at the risk of our lives, we hung him on the fore-sheet cleat. He emitted no sound. He looked as ridiculously lamentable as a doll that had lost half its sawdust, and we started on our perilous journey over the main deck, dragging along with care that pitiful, that limp, that hateful burden. He was not very heavy, but had he weighed a ton he could not have been more awkward to handle. We literally passed him from hand to hand. Now and then we had to hang him up on a handy belaying pin to draw a breath and reform the line. Had the pin broken he would have irretrievably gone into the Southern Ocean, but he had to take his chance of that, and after a little while, becoming apparently aware of it, he groaned slightly and with a great effort whispered a few words. We listened eagerly. He was reproaching us with our carelessness in letting him run such risks. "Now, after I got myself out from there," he breathed weakly. "There was his cabin. And he got himself out. We had nothing to do with it, apparently. No matter. We went on and let him take his chances, simply because we could not help it. For though at the time we hated him more than ever, more than anything under heaven, we did not want to lose him. We had so far saved him, and it had become a personal matter between us and the sea. We meant to stick to him. Had we, by an incredible hypothesis, undergone similar toil and trouble for an empty cask, that cask would have become as precious to us as Jimmy was. More precious, in fact, because we would have had no reason to hate the cask. And we hated James Waite. We could not get rid of the monstrous suspicion that this astounding black man was shamming sick, had been malingering heartlessly in the face of our toil, of our scorn, of our patience, and now was malingering in the face of our devotion, in the face of death. Our vague and imperfect morality rose with disgust at his unmanly lie. But he stuck to it manfully, amazingly. No, it couldn't be. He was at all extremity. His cantankerous temper was only the result of the provoking invincibleness of that death he felt by his side. Any man may be angry with such a masterful chum, but then, what kind of men were we, with our thoughts? Indignation and doubt grappled within us in a scuffle that trampled upon the finest of our feelings. And we hated him because of the suspicion, we detested him because of the doubt. We could not scorn him safely, neither could we pity him without risk to our dignity. So we hated him and passed him carefully from hand to hand. We cried, "Got him? Yes, all right, let go." And he swung from one enemy to another, showing about as much life as an old bolster would do. His eyes made two narrow white slits in the black face. The air escaped through his lips with a noise like the sound of bellows. We reached the poop ladder at last, and it being a comparatively safe place, we lay for a moment in an exhausted heap to rest a little. He began to mutter. We were always incurably anxious to hear what he had to say. This time he mumbled peevishly, "It took you some time to come. I began to think the whole smart lot of you had been washed overboard. What kept you back? Hey? Funk?" We said nothing. With sighs we started again to drag him up. The secret and ardent desire of our hearts was the desire to beat him viciously with our fists about the head, and we handled him as tenderly as though he had been made of glass. The return on the poop was like the return of wanderers after many years amongst people marked by the desolation of time. Eyes were turned slowly in their sockets, glancing at us. Faint murmurs were heard. "Have you got him, after all?" The well-known faces looked strange and familiar. They seemed faded and grimy. They had a mingled expression of fatigue and eagerness. They seemed to have become much thinner during our absence, as if all these men had been starved for a long time in their abandoned attitudes. The captain, with a round turn of a rope on his wrist, and kneeling on one knee, swung with a face cold and stiff, but with living eyes he was still holding the ship up, heeding no one, as if lost in the unearthly effort of that endeavour. We fastened up James Wait in a safe place. Mr. Baker scrambled along to lend a hand. Mr. Crichton, on his back, and very pale, muttered, "Well done," and gave us, Jimmy and the sky, a scornful glance, then closed his eyes slowly. Here and there a man stirred a little, but most of them remained apathetic in cramped positions, muttering between shivers. The sun was setting, a sun enormous, unclouded and red, declining low as if bending down to look into their faces. The wind whistled across long sunbeams that, resplendent and cold, struck full on the dilated pupils of staring eyes without making them wink. The wisps of hair and tangled beards were grey with the salt of the sea. The faces were earthy, and the dark patches under the eyes extended to the ears, smudged into the hollows of sunken cheeks. The lips were livid and thin, and when they moved it was with difficulty, as though they had been glued to the teeth. Some grinned sadly in the sunlight, shaking with cold. Others were sad and still. Charley, subdued by the sudden disclosure of the insignificance of his youth, darted fearful glances. The two smooth-faced Norwegians resembled decrepit children, staring stupidly. To leeward, on the edge of the horizon, black seas leaped up towards the glowing sun. It sank slowly, round and blazing, and the crests of waves splashed on the edge of the luminous circle. One of the Norwegians appeared to catch sight of it, and, after giving a violent start, began to speak. His voice, startling the others, made them stir. They moved their heads stiffly, or turning with difficulty, looked at him with surprise, with fear, or in grave silence. He chattered at the setting sun, nodding his head, while the big seas began to roll across the crimson disk, and over miles of turbulent water the shadows of high waves swept with a running darkness the faces of men. A crested roller broke with a loud hissing roar, and the sun, as if put out, disappeared. The chattering voice faltered, went out together with the light. There were sighs. In the sudden lull that follows the crash of a broken sea, a man said wearily, "Here's that bloomin' Dutchman gone off his chump." A seaman, lashed by the middle, tapped the deck with his open hand with unceasing quick flaps. In the gathering greyness of twilight a bulky form was seen rising aft, and began marching on all fours with the movements of some big cautious beast. It was Mr. Baker passing along the line of men. He grunted encouragingly over every one, felt their fastenings. Some, with half-open eyes, puffed like men oppressed by heat; others mechanically and in a dreamy voice answered him, "Aye, aye, sir." He went from one to another grunting, "Ough! See her through it yet," and unexpectedly, with loud angry outbursts, blew up Knowles for cutting off a long piece from the fall of the relieving tackle. "Ough! Ashamed of yourself! Relieving tackle! Don't you know better? Ough! Able seaman! Ough!" The lame man was crushed. He muttered, "Get something for a lashing for myself, sir." "Ough! Lashing! Yourself! Are you a tinker or a sailor? What? Ough! May want that tackle directly. Ough! More use to the ship than your lame carcass. Ough! Keep it! Keep it now you've done it." He crawled away slowly, muttering to himself about some men being worse than children. It had been a comforting row. Low exclamations were heard, "Hello! Hello!" Those who had been painfully dozing asked with convulsive starts, "What's up? What is it?" The answers came with unexpected cheerfulness. "The mate is going bald-headed for lame Jack about something or other." "No! What has he done?" Someone even chuckled. It was like a whiff of hope, like a reminder of safe days. Donkin, who had been stupefied with fear, revived suddenly and began to shout. "'Ear 'im, that's the way they talk to us. Why don't ye 'it 'im, one of yer? 'It 'im, 'it 'im, comin' the mate over us. We are as good men as 'e. We're all going to 'ell now. We have been starved in this rotten ship and now we're going to be drownded for them black-'earted bullies. 'It 'im!" He shrieked in the deepening gloom, he blubbered and sobbed, screaming, "'It 'im! 'It 'im!" The rage and fear of his disregarded right to live tried the steadfastness of hearts more than the menacing shadows of the night that advanced through the unceasing clamour of the gale. From aft Mr. Baker was heard, "Is one of you men going to stop him? Must I come along?" "Shut up! Keep quiet!" cried various voices, exasperated, trembling with cold. "You'll get one across the mug from me directly," said an invisible seaman in a weary tone. "I won't let the mate have the trouble." He ceased and lay still, with the silence of despair. On the black sky the stars, coming out, gleamed over an inky sea that, sprinkled with foam, flashed back at them the effervescent and pale light of a dazzling whiteness born from the black turmoil of the waves. Remote in the eternal calm they glittered hard and cold above the uproar of the earth. They surrounded the vanquished and tormented ship on all sides, more pitiless than the eyes of a triumphant mob and unapproachable as the hearts of men. The icy south wind howled exultantly under the sombre splendour of the sky. The cold shook the men with a resistless violence as though it had tried to shake them to pieces. Short moans were swept unheard off the stiff lips. Some complained in mutters of not feeling themselves below the waist, while those who had closed their eyes imagined they had a block of ice on their chests. Others, alarmed at not feeling any pain in their fingers, beat the deck feebly with their hands, obstinate and exhausted. Wamibo stared vacant and dreamy. The Scandinavians kept on a meaningless mutter through chattering teeth. The spare Scotsmen, with determined efforts, kept their lower jaws still. The West Countrymen lay big and stolid in an invulnerable surliness. A man yawned and swore in turns. Another breathed with a rattle in his throat. Two elderly, hard-weather shellbacks, fast side by side, whispered dismally to one another about the landlady of a boarding-house in Sunderland, whom they both knew. They extolled her motherliness and her liberality. They tried to talk about the joint of beef and the big fire in the downstairs kitchen. The words dying faintly on their lips ended in light sighs. A sudden voice cried into the cold night, "O Lord!" No one changed his position or took any notice of the cry. One or two passed with the repeated and vague gestures, their hand over their faces, but most of them kept very still. In the benumbed immovability of their bodies they were excessively wearied by their thoughts, which rushed with the rapidity and vividness of dreams. Now and then, with an abrupt and startling exclamation, they answered the weird hail of some illusion, then again in silence contemplated the vision of known faces and familiar things. They recalled the aspect of forgotten shipmates and heard the voice of dead and gone skippers. They remembered the noise of gaslit streets, the steamy heat of tap rooms, or the scorching sunshine of calm days at sea. End of Chapter 3, Part 2. Chapter 3, Part 3 of The Nigger of the Narcissus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Nigger of the Narcissus by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 3, Part 3. Mr. Baker left his insecure place and crawled, with stoppages, along the poop. In the dark and on all fours he resembled some carnivorous animal prowling amongst corpses. At the break, propped to windward of a stanchion, he looked down on the main deck. It seemed to him that the ship had a tendency to stand up a little more. The wind had eased a little, he thought, but the sea ran as high as ever. The waves foamed viciously, and the lee side of the deck disappeared under a hissing whiteness as of boiling milk, while the rigging sang steadily with a deep vibrating note, and at every upward swing of the ship the wind rushed with a long-drawn clamour amongst the spars. Mr. Baker watched very still. A man near him began to make a blabbing noise with his lips, all at once, and very loud, as though the cold had broken brutally through him. He went on, "Ba, ba, ba, brr, brr, ba, ba." "Stop that!" cried Mr. Baker, groping in the dark. "Stop it!" He went on shaking the leg he found under his hand. "What is it, sir?" called out Belfast, in the tone of a man awakened suddenly. "We're looking after that 'ere Jimmy." "Are you? 'Ock, don't make that row, then. Who's that near you?" "It's me, the boatswain, sir," growled the West Country man. "We are trying to keep the life in that poor devil." "Aye, aye," said Mr. Baker. "Do it quietly, can't you?" "He wants us to hold him up above the rail," went on the boatswain, with irritation. "Says he can't breathe here under our jackets." "If we lift him, we drop him overboard," said another voice. "We can't feel our hands with cold." "I don't care, I'm choking!" exclaimed James Waite in a clear tone. "Oh no, my son," said the boatswain desperately. "You don't go till we all go on this fine night." "You will see yet many a worse," said Mr. Baker cheerfully. "It's no child's play, sir," answered the boatswain. "Some of us further aft, here, are in a pretty bad way." "If the blamed sticks had been cut out of her, she would be running along on her bottom now like any decent ship, and give us all a chance," said someone, with a sigh. "The old man wouldn't have it, much he cares for us," whispered another. "Care for you!" exclaimed Mr. Baker angrily. "Why should he care for you? Are you a lot of women passengers to be taken care of? We are here to take care of the ship, and some of you ain't up to that." "Ough! What have you done so very smart to be taken care of? Ough! Some of you can't stand a bit of a breeze without crying over it." "Come, sar, we ain't so bad," protested Belfast, in a voice shaken by shivers. "We ain't... brr." "Again!" shouted the mate, grabbing at the shadowy form. "Again! Why, you're in your shirt! What have you done?" "I've put my oilskin and jacket over that half-dead naygger, and he says he chokes," said Belfast complainingly. "You wouldn't call me nigger if I wasn't half dead, you Irish beggar," boomed James Waite vigorously. You wouldn't be white if you were ever so well. I will fight you, in fine weather, with one hand tied behind my back, I don't want your rags, I want air, gasped out the other faintly, as if suddenly exhausted. The sprays swept over whistling and pattering. Men disturbed in their peaceful torpor by the pain of quarrelsome shouts moaned, muttering curses. Mr. Baker crawled off a little way to leeward where a water cask loomed up big with something white against it. "Is it you, Podmore?" asked Mr. Baker. He had to repeat the question twice before the cook turned, coughing feebly. "Yes, sir. I've been praying in my mind for a quick deliverance, for I am prepared for any call. I—" "Look here, cook," interrupted Mr. Baker. "The men are perishing with cold." "Cold," said the cook mournfully. "They will be warm enough before long." "What?" asked Mr. Baker, looking along the deck into the faint sheen of frothing water. "They are a wicked lot," continued the cook solemnly, but in an unsteady voice. "About as wicked as any ship's company in this sinful world. Now he trembled so that he could hardly speak. His was an exposed place, and in a cotton shirt, a thin pair of trousers, and with his knees under his nose, he received quaking the flicks of stinging salt drops. His voice sounded exhausted. Now, any time. My eldest youngster, Mr. Baker, a clever boy, last Sunday on shore before this voyage, he wouldn't go to church, sir. Says I, you go and clean yourself or I'll know the reason why. What does he do? Pond, Mr. Baker, fell into the pond in his best rig, sir. Accident? Nothing will save you, fine scholar though you are, says I. Accident? I whomped him, sir, till I couldn't lift my arm. His voice faltered. I whopped him, he repeated, rattling his teeth. Then after a while let out a mournful sound that was half a groan, half a snore. Mr. Baker shook him by the shoulders. "Hey, cook, hold up, Podmore. Tell me, is there any fresh water in the galley tank? The ship is lying along less, I think. I would try to get forward. A little water would do them good. Hullo, look out! Look out!" The cook struggled. "Not you, sir, not you." He began to scramble to windward. "Galley! My business!" he shouted. "Cook's going crazy now," said several voices. He yelled, "Crazy, am I? I am more ready to die than any of you officers inclusive. There. As long as she swims, I will cook. I will get you coffee." "Cook, ye are a gentleman!" cried Belfast. But the cook was already going over the weather ladder. He stopped for a moment to shout back on the poop, "As long as she swims, I will cook," and disappeared as though he had gone overboard. The men who had heard sent after him a cheer that sounded like a wail of sick children. An hour or more afterwards someone said distinctly, "He's gone for good." "Very likely," assented the boatswain. "Even in fine weather he was as smart about the deck as a milch cow on her first voyage. We ought to go and see." Nobody moved. As the hours dragged slowly through the darkness, Mr. Baker crawled back and forth along the poop several times. Some men fancied they had heard him exchange murmurs with the master, but at that time the memories were incomparably more vivid than anything actual, and they were not certain whether the murmurs were heard now or many years ago. They did not try to find out. A mutter, more or less, did not matter. It was too cold for curiosity and almost for hope. They could not spare a moment or a thought from the great mental occupation of wishing to live. And the desire of life kept them alive, apathetic and enduring, under the cruel persistence of wind and cold, while the bestarred black dome of the sky revolved slowly above the ship that drifted, bearing their patience and their suffering through the stormy solitude of the sea. Huddled close to one another, they fancied themselves utterly alone. They heard sustained loud noises, and again bore the pain of existence through long hours of profound silence. In the night they saw sunshine, felt warmth, and suddenly, with a start, thought that the sun would never rise upon a freezing world. Some heard laughter, listened to songs. Others, near the end of the poop, could hear loud human shrieks, and, opening their eyes, were surprised to hear them still, though very faint and far away. The boatswain said, "Why, it's the cook, hailing from forward, I think." He hardly believed his own words or recognized his own voice. It was a long time before the man next to him gave a sign of life. He punched hard his other neighbor and said, "The cook's shouting." Many did not understand, others did not care, the majority further aft did not believe. But the boatswain and another man had the pluck to crawl away forward to see. They seemed to have been gone for hours and were very soon forgotten. Then suddenly men who had been plunged in a hopeless resignation became as if possessed with the desire to hurt. They belaboured one another with fists. In the darkness they struck persistently anything soft they could feel near, and with a greater effort than for a shout whispered excitedly, "They've got some hot coffee." "Bosun got it." "No. Where?" "It's coming. Cook made it." James Waite moaned. Donkin scrambled viciously, caring not where he kicked, and anxious that the officer should have none of it. It came in a pot, and they drank in turns. It was hot, and while it blistered the greedy palates it seemed incredible. The men sighed out, parting with the mug. "'Ow 'as he done it?" Some cried weakly, "Bully for you, doctor." He had done it somehow. Afterwards Archie declared that the thing was "miraculous." For many days we wondered, and it was the one ever interesting subject of conversation to the end of the voyage. We asked the cook, in fine weather, how he felt when he saw his stove reared up on end. We inquired, in the northeast trade and on serene evenings, whether he had to stand on his head to put things right somewhat. We suggested he had used his breadboard for a raft, and from there comfortably had stoked his grate, and we did our best to conceal our admiration under the wit of fine irony. He affirmed not to know anything about it, rebuked our levity, declared himself, with solemn animation, to have been the object of a special mercy for the saving of our unholy lives. Fundamentally he was right, no doubt, but he need not have been so offensively positive about it. He need not have hinted so often that it would have gone hard with us had he not been there, meritorious and pure, to receive the inspiration and the strength for the work of grace. Had we been saved by his recklessness or his agility, we could have at length become reconciled to the fact, but to admit our obligation to anybody's virtue and holiness alone was as difficult for us as for any other handful of mankind. Like many benefactors of humanity, the cook took himself too seriously, and reaped the reward of irreverence. We were not ungrateful, however. He remained heroic. His saying, the saying of his life, became proverbial in the mouth of men, as are the sayings of conquerors or sages. Later, whenever one of us was puzzled by a task and advised to relinquish it, he would express his determination to persevere and to succeed by the words, "As long as she swims, I will cook." The hot drink helped us through the bleak hours that precede the dawn. The sky low by the horizon took on the delicate tints of pink and yellow like the inside of a rare shell. And higher, where it glowed with a pearly sheen, a small black cloud appeared, like a forgotten fragment of the night set in a border of dazzling gold. The beams of light skipped on the crest of waves. The eyes of men turned to the eastward. The sunlight flooded their weary faces. They were giving themselves up to fatigue as though they had done forever with their work. On Singleton's black oilskin coat the dried salt glistened like hoarfrost. He hung on by the wheel with open and lifeless eyes. Captain Allistoun, unblinking, faced the rising sun. His lips stirred, opened for the first time in 24 hours, and with a fresh, firm voice he cried, "Wear ship!" The commanding sharp tones made all those torpid men start like a sudden flick of a whip. Then again, motionless where they lay, The force of habit made some of them repeat the order in hardly audible murmurs. Captain Allistoun glanced down at his crew, and several, with fumbling fingers and hopeless movements, tried to cast themselves adrift. He repeated impatiently, "Wear ship. Now then, Mr. Baker, get the men along. What's the matter with them? Wear ship. Do you hear there?" "Wear ship!" thundered out the boatswain suddenly. His voice seemed to break through a deadly spell. Men began to stir and crawl. "I want the foretopmast staysail run up smartly," said the master, very loudly. "If you can't manage it standing up, you must do it lying down. That's all. Bear a hand. Come along. Let's give the old girl a chance," urged the boatswain. "Aye, aye, wear ship!" exclaimed quavering voices. The forecastle men with reluctant faces prepared to go forward. Mr. Baker pushed ahead, grunting on all fours to show the way, and they followed him over the break. The others lay still with a vile hope in their hearts of not being required to move till they got saved or drowned in peace. After some time they could be seen forward appearing on the forecastle head, one by one in unsafe attitudes, hanging on to the rails, clambering over the anchors, embracing the crosshead of the windlass or hugging the forecapstan. They were restless with strange exertions, waved their arms, knelt, lay flat down, staggered up, seemed to strive their hardest to go overboard. Suddenly a small white piece of canvas fluttered amongst them, grew larger, beating. Its narrow head rose in jerks, and at last it stood distended and triangular in the sunshine. "They have done it!" cried the voices aft. Captain Allistoun let go the rope he had round his wrist, and rolled to leeward headlong. He could be seen casting the lee main braces off the pins, while the backwash of waves splashed over him. "Square the mainyard!" he shouted up to us, who stared at him in wonder. We hesitated to stir. "The main brace, men! Haul! Haul anyhow! Lay on your backs and haul!" he screeched, half drowned down there. We did not believe we could move the mainyard, but the strongest and the less discouraged tried to execute the order. Others assisted half-heartedly. Singleton's eyes blazed suddenly as he took a fresh grip of the spokes. Captain Allistoun fought his way up to windward. "Haul, men! Try to move it! Haul, and help the ship!" His hard face worked suffused and furious. "Is she going off, Singleton?" he cried. "Not a move yet, sir," croaked the old seaman in a horribly hoarse voice. "Watch the helm, Singleton," sputtered the master. "Haul, men! Have you no more strength than rats? Haul, and earn your salt!" Mr. Creighton, on his back, with a swollen leg and a face as white as a piece of paper, blinked his eyes, his bluish lips twitched. In the wild scramble men grabbed at him, crawled over his hurt leg, knelt on his chest. He kept perfectly still, setting his teeth without a moan, without a sigh. The master's ardour, the cries of that silent man, inspired us. We hauled and hung in bunches on the rope. We heard him say with violence to Donkin, who sprawled abjectly on his stomach, "I will brain you with this belaying pin if you don't catch hold of the brace," and that victim of man's injustice, cowardly and cheeky, whimpered, "Are you going to murder us now?" while with sudden desperation he gripped the rope. Men sighed, shouted, hissed meaningless words, groaned. The yards moved, came slowly square against the wind that hummed loudly on the yard arms. "Going off, sir," shouted Singleton. "She's just started." "Catch a turn with that brace! Catch a turn!" clamoured the master. Mr. Creighton, nearly suffocated and unable to move, made a mighty effort, and with his left hand managed to nip the rope. "Haul fast!" cried someone. He closed his eyes as if going off into a swoon, while huddled together about the brace we watched with scared looks what the ship would do now. She went off slowly, as though she had been weary and disheartened like the men she carried. She paid off very gradually, making us hold our breath till we choked, and as soon as she had brought the wind abaft the beam she started to move and fluttered our hearts. It was awful to see her, nearly overturned, begin to gather way and drag her submerged side through the water. The dead eyes of the rigging churned the breaking seas. The lower half of the deck was full of mad whirlpools and eddies, and the long line of the lee rail could be seen showing black now and then in the swirls of a field of foam as dazzling and white as a field of snow. The wind sang shrilly amongst the spars, and at every slight lurch we expected her to slip to the bottom sideways from under our backs. When dead before it, she made the first distinct attempt to stand up, and we encouraged her with a feeble and discordant howl. A great sea came running up aft and hung for a moment over us with a curling top, then crashed down under the counter and spread out on both sides into a great sheet of bursting froth. Above its fierce hiss we heard Singleton's croak, "She is steering!" He had both his feet now planted firmly on the grating, and the wheel spun fast as he eased the helm. "Bring the wind on the port quarter and steady her," called out the master, staggering to his feet, the first man up from amongst our prostrate heap. One or two screamed with excitement, "She rises!" Far away forward Mr. Baker and three others were seen erect and black on the clear sky, lifting their arms, and with open mouths as though they had been shouting all together. The ship trembled, trying to lift her side, lurched back, seemed to give up with a nerveless dip, and suddenly, with an unexpected jerk, swung violently to windward, as though she had torn herself out from a deadly grasp. The whole immense volume of water lifted by her deck was thrown bodily across to starboard. Loud cracks were heard. Iron ports breaking open thundered with ringing blows. The water topped over the starboard rail with the rush of a river falling over a dam. The sea on deck and the seas on every side of her mingled together in a deafening roar. She rolled violently. We got up and were helplessly run or flung about from side to side. Men rolling over and over yelled, "The house will go! She clears herself!" Lifted by a towering sea, she ran along with it for a moment, spouting thick streams of water through every opening of her wounded sides. The lee braces having been carried away or washed off the pins, all the ponderous yards on the fore swung from side to side, and with appalling rapidity at every roll. The men forward were seen crouching here and there with fearful glances upwards at the enormous spars that whirled about over their heads. The torn canvas and the ends of broken gear streamed in the wind like wisps of hair. Through the clear sunshine, over the flashing turmoil and uproar of the seas, the ship ran blindly, dishevelled and headlong, as if fleeing for her life, and on the poop we spun, we tottered about, distracted and noisy. We all spoke at once in a thin babble. We had the aspects of invalids and the gestures of maniacs. Eyes shone, large and haggard and smiling, meagre faces that seemed to have been dusted over with powdered chalk. We stamped, clapped our hands, feeling ready to jump and do anything, but in reality hardly able to keep on our feet. Captain Allistoun, hard and slim, gesticulated madly from the poop at Mr. Baker. "Steady those foreyards. Steady them the best you can." On the main deck, men, excited by his cries, splashed, dashing aimlessly, here and there, with the foam swirling up to their waists. Apart, far aft and alone by the helm, old Singleton had deliberately tucked his white beard under the top button of his glistening coat. Swaying upon the dim and tumult of the seas, with the whole battered length of the ship launched forward in a rolling rush before his steady old eyes, he stood rigidly still, forgotten by all, and with an attentive face. In front of his erect figure only the two arms moved crosswise with a swift and sudden readiness to check or urge again the rapid stir of circling spokes. He steered with care. End of chapter 3. The Nigger of the Narcissus. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Nigger of the Narcissus by Joseph Conrad, Chapter 4, Part 1. On men reprieved by its disdainful mercy, the immortal sea confers in its justice the full privilege of desired unrest. Through the perfect wisdom of its grace, they are not permitted to meditate at ease upon the complicated and acrid savour of existence. They must without pause justify their life to the eternal pity that commands toil to be hard and unceasing, from sunrise to sunset, from sunset to sunrise, till the weary succession of nights and days tainted by the obstinate clamour of sages, demanding bliss and an empty heaven, is redeemed at last by the vast silence of pain and labour, by the dumb fear and the dumb courage of men obscure, forgetful, and enduring. The master and Mr. Baker, coming face to face, stared for a moment with the intense and amazed looks of men meeting unexpectedly after years of trouble. Their voices were gone, and they whispered desperately at one another. "Anyone missing?" asked Captain Allistoun. "No, all there." "Anyone hurt?" "Only the second mate." "I will look after him directly. We're lucky." "Very," articulated Mr. Baker, faintly. He gripped the rail and rolled bloodshot eyes. The little grey man made an effort to raise his voice above a dull mutter, and fixed his chief mate with a cold gaze, piercing like a dart. "Get sail on the ship," he said, speaking authoritatively and with an inflexible snap of his thin lips. "Get sail on her as soon as you can. This is a fair wind. At once, sir. Don't give the men time to feel themselves. They will get done up and stiff, and we will never. We must get her along now." He reeled to a long, heavy roll. The rail dipped into the glancing, hissing water. He caught his shroud, swung helplessly against the mate. "Now we have a fair wind at last. Make sail." His head rolled from shoulder to shoulder. His eyelids began to beat rapidly. "And the pumps. Pumps, Mr. Baker." He peered as though the face within a foot of his eyes had been a half-mile off. "Keep the men on the move to get her along," he mumbled, in a drowsy tone, like a man going off into a doze. He pulled himself together suddenly. "Mustn't stand. Won't do," he said with a painful attempt at a smile. He let go his hold, and, propelled by the dip of the ship, ran aft unwillingly with small steps, till he brought up against the binnacle stand. Hanging on there, he looked up in an aimless manner at Singleton, who, unheeding him, watched anxiously the end of the jib boom. "Steering gear works all right?" he asked. There was a noise in the old seaman's throat, as though the words had been rattling together before they could come out. "Steers like a little boat," he said at last, with hoarse tenderness, without giving the master as much as half a glance. Then, watchfully, spun the wheel down, steadied, flung it back again. Captain Allistoun tore himself away from the delight of leaning against the binnacle, and began to walk the poop, swaying and reeling to preserve his balance. The pump rods, clanking, stamped in short jumps while the fly wheels turned smoothly, with great speed, at the foot of the mainmast, flinging back and forth with a regular impetuosity two limp clusters of men clinging to the handles. They abandoned themselves, swaying from the hip with twitching faces and stony eyes. The carpenter, sounding from time to time, exclaimed mechanically, "Shake her up! Keep her going!" Mr. Baker could not speak, but found his voice to shout, and under the goad of his objurgations, men looked to the lashings, dragged out new sails, and, thinking themselves unable to move, carried heavy blocks aloft, overhauled the gear. They went up the rigging with faltering and desperate efforts. Their heads swam as they shifted their hold, stepped blindly on the yards like men in the dark, or trusted themselves to the first rope at hand with the negligence of exhausted strength. The narrow escapes from falls did not disturb the languid beat of their hearts. The roar of the seas seething far below sounded continuous and faint, like an indistinct noise from another world. The wind filled their eyes with tears, and with heavy gusts tried to push them off from where they swayed in insecure positions. With streaming faces and blowing hair, they flew up and down between sky and water, bestriding the ends of yard arms, crouching on foot ropes, embracing lifts to have their hands free or standing up against chain ties. Their thoughts floated vaguely between the desire of rest and the desire of life, while their stiffened fingers cast off head earrings, fumbled for knives, or held with tenacious grip against the violent shocks of beating canvas. They glared savagely at one another, made frantic signs with one hand while they held their life in the other, looked down on a narrow strip of flooded deck, shouted along to leeward, "Light to! Haul out! Make fast!" Their lips moved, their eyes started, furious and eager with the desire to be understood, but the wind tossed their words unheard upon the disturbed sea. In an unendurable and unending strain they worked like men driven by a merciless dream to toil in an atmosphere of ice or flame. They burnt and shivered in turns. Their eyeballs smarted as if in the smoke of a conflagration, their heads were ready to burst with every shout. Hard fingers seemed to grip their throats. At every roll they thought, "Now I must let go. It will shake us all off," and thrown about aloft they cried wildly, "Look out there! Catch the end! Reeve clear! Turn this block!" They nodded desperately, shook infuriated faces. "No, no! From down up!" They seemed to hate one another with a deadly hate; the longing to be done with it all gnawed their breasts, and the wish to do things well was a burning pain. They cursed their fate, condemned their lives, and wasted their breath in deadly imprecations upon one another. The sailmaker, with his bald head bared, worked feverishly, forgetting his intimacy with so many admirals. The boatswain, climbing up with marlinspikes and bunches of spun yarn roving, or kneeling on the yard and ready to take a turn with the midship stop, had acute and fleeting visions of his old woman and the youngsters in a moorland village. Mr. Baker, feeling very weak, tottered here and there, grunting and inflexible, like a man of iron. He waylaid those who, coming from aloft, stood gasping for breath. He ordered, encouraged, scolded. "Now then, to the top mainsail now! Tally on to that gantline! Don't stand about there!" "Is there no rest for us?" muttered voices. He spun round fiercely, with a sinking heart. "No! No rest till the work is done. Work till you drop. That's what you're here for." A bowed seaman at his elbow gave a short laugh. "Do or die," he croaked bitterly, then spat into his broad palms, swung up his long arms, and grasping the rope high above his head sent out a mournful, wailing cry for a pull all together. A sea boarded the quarter-deck and sent the whole lot sprawling to leeward. Caps, handspikes floated. Clenched hands, kicking legs, with here and there a spluttering face, struck out of the white hiss of foaming water. Mr. Baker, knocked down with a rest, screamed, "Don't let go that rope! Hold on to it! Hold!" And sorely bruised by the brutal fling, they held on to it, as though it had been the fortune of their life. The ship ran, rolling heavily, and the topping crests glanced past port and starboard, flashing their white heads. Pumps were freed. Braces were rove. The three topsails and foresail were set. She spurted faster over the water, outpacing the swift rush of waves. The menacing thunder of distant seas rose behind her, filled the air with the tremendous vibrations of its voice. And devastated, battered, and wounded, she drove foaming to the northward, as though inspired by the courage of a high endeavour. The forecastle was a place of damp desolation. They looked at their dwelling with dismay. It was slimy, dripping. It hummed hollow with the wind, and was strewn with shapeless wreckage like a half-tide cavern in a rocky and exposed coast. Many had lost all they had in the world, but most of the starboard watch had preserved their chests. Thin streams of water trickled out of them, however. The beds were soaked, the blankets spread out and saved by some nail squashed underfoot. They dragged wet rags from evil-smelling corners, and wringing the water out recognized their property. Some smiled stiffly. Others looked round blank and mute. There were cries of joy over old waistcoats, and groans of sorrow over shapeless things found among the splinters of smashed bedboards. One lamp was discovered jammed under the bowsprit. Charley whimpered a little. Noel stumped here and there, sniffing, examining dark places for salvage. He poured dirty water out of a boot and was concerned to find the owner. Those who, overwhelmed by their losses, sat on the forepeak hatch, remained elbows on knees, and with a fist against each cheek, disdained to look up. He pushed it under their noses. "Here's a good boot. Yours?" They snarled, "No, get out." One snapped at him, "Take it to hell out of this." He seemed surprised. "Why? It's a good boot." But remembering suddenly that he had lost every stitch of his clothing, he dropped his find and began to swear. In the dim light cursing voices clashed. A man came in and, dropping his arms, stood still, repeating from the doorstep: "'Ere's a bloomin' old go. 'Ere's a bloomin' old go." A few rooted anxiously in flooded chests for tobacco. They breathed hard, clamoured with heads down. "Look at that Jack." "Here, Sam, here's my shore-going rig spoilt for ever." One blasphemed tearfully, holding out a pair of dripping trousers. No one looked at him. The cat came out from somewhere. He had an ovation. They'd snatched him from hand to hand, caressed him in a murmur of pet names. They wondered where he had weathered it out, disputed about it. A squabbling argument began. Two men brought in a bucket of fresh water and all crowded round it, but Tom, lean and mewing, came up with every hair astir and had the first drink. A couple of hands went aft for oil and biscuits. Then in the yellow light and in the intervals of mopping the deck they crunched hard bread, arranging to worry through somehow. Men chummed as to beds. Turns were settled for wearing boots and having the use of oilskin coats. They called one another "old man" and "sonny" in cheery voices. Friendly slaps resounded. Jokes were shouted. One or two stretched on the wet deck, slept with heads pillowed on their bent arms, and several, sitting on the hatch, smoked. Their weary faces appeared through a thin blue haze, pacified and with sparkling eyes. The boatswain put his head through the door. "Relieve the wheel, one of you," he shouted inside. "It's 6. Blammy if that old Singleton hasn't been there more'n 30 hours. You are a fine lot." He slammed the door again. "Mate's watch on deck," said someone. "Hey, Donkin, it's your relief," shouted 3 or 4 together. He had crawled into an empty bunk and on wet planks lay still. "Donkin, your wheel." He made no sound. "Donkin's dead," guffawed someone. "Sell his bloomin' clothes," shouted another. "Donkin, if ye don't go to the bloomin' wheel they will sell your clothes. D'ye hear?" jeered a third. He groaned from his dark hole. He complained about pains in all his bones. He whimpered pitifully. "He won't go," exclaimed a contemptuous voice. "Your turn, Davis." The young seaman rose painfully, squaring his shoulders. Donkin stuck his head out, and it appeared in the yellow light, fragile and ghastly. "I will give yer a pound of tobaccer," he whined in a conciliating voice, "so soon as I draw it from aft. I will, s'elp me." Davis swung his arm backhanded, and the head vanished. "I'll go," he said, "but you will pay for it." He walked unsteady but resolute to the door. "So I will," yelped Donkin, popping out behind him. "So I will, s'elp me. A pound 3 bob they chawge." Davis flung the door open. "You will pay my price in fine weather," he shouted over his shoulder. One of the men unbuttoned his wet coat rapidly, threw it at his head. "Here, Taffy, take that, you thief!" "Thank you," he cried from the darkness above the swish of rolling water. He could be heard splashing. A sea came on board with a thump. "He's got his bath already," remarked a grim shellback. "Aye, aye," grunted others. Then, after a long silence, Wamibo made strange noises. "Hello, what's up with you?" said someone grumpily. "He says he would have gone for Davy," explained Archie, who was the Finn's interpreter generally. "I believe him," cried voices. "Never mind, Dutchy, you'll do, Muddlehead. Your turn will come soon enough. You don't know when you're well off." They ceased and all together turned their faces to the door. Singleton stepped in, advanced 2 paces, and stood swaying slightly. The sea hissed, flowed roaring past the bows, and the forecastle trembled, full of deep murmurs. The lamp flared, swinging like a pendulum. He looked with a dreamy and puzzled stare, as though he could not distinguish the still men from their restless shadows. There were awestruck exclamations. "Hullo! Hullo! How does it look outside now, Singleton?" Those who sat on the hatch lifted their eyes in silence, and the next oldest seaman in the ship those two understood one another, though they hardly exchanged 3 words in a day gazed up at his friend attentively for a moment, then taking a short clay pipe out of his mouth, offered it without a word. Singleton put out his arm toward it, missed, staggered, and suddenly fell forward, crashing down, stiff and headlong, like an uprooted tree. There was a swift rush. Men pushed, crying, "He's done! Turn him over! Stand clear there!" Under a crowd of startled faces bending over him, he lay on his back, staring upward in a continuous and intolerable manner. In the breathless silence of a general consternation he said in a grating murmur, "I am all right," and clutched with his hands. They helped him up. He mumbled despondently, "I am getting old, old." "Not you!" cried Belfast, with ready tact. Supported on all sides he hung his head. "Are you better?" they asked. He glared at them from under his eyebrows with large black eyes, spreading over his chest the bushy whiteness of a beard long and thick. "Old, old," he repeated sternly. Helped along, he reached his bunk. There was in it a slimy soft heap of something that smelled, as does at dead low water a muddy foreshore. It was his soaked straw bed. With a convulsive effort he pitched himself onto it, and in the darkness of the narrow place could be heard growling angrily, like an irritated and savage animal uneasy in its den. "Bit of breeze. Small thing. Can't stand up. Old." He slept at last, high-booted, sou'wester on head, and his oilskin clothes rustled when with a deep sighing groan he turned over. Men conversed about him in quiet, concerned whispers. "This will break him up. Strong as a horse. Aye, but he ain't what he used to be." In sad murmurs they gave him up. Yet at midnight he turned out to duty as if nothing had been the matter, and answered to his name with a mournful "Here." He brooded alone more than ever, in an impenetrable silence and with a saddened face. For many years he had heard himself called Old Singleton, and had serenely accepted the qualification, taking it as a tribute of respect due to a man who through half a century had measured his strength against the favours and the rages of the sea. He had never given a thought to his mortal self. He lived unscathed, as though he had been indestructible, surrendering to all the temptations, weathering many gales. He had panted in sunshine, shivered in the cold, suffered hunger, thirst, debauch, passed through many trials, known all the furies. Old. It seemed to him he was broken at last. And like a man bound treacherously while he sleeps, he woke up fettered by the long chain of disregarded years. He had to take up at once the burden of all his existence, and found it almost too heavy for his strength. Old. He moved his arms, shook his head, felt his limbs. Getting old. And then? He looked upon the immortal sea with the awakened and groping perception of its heartless might. He saw it unchanged, black and foaming under the eternal scrutiny of the stars. He heard its impatient voice calling for him out of a pitiless vastness full of unrest, of turmoil, and of terror. He looked afar upon it. He saw an immensity tormented and blind, moaning and furious, that claimed all the days of its tenacious life and, when life was over, would claim the worn-out body of its slave. That was the last of the breeze. It veered quickly, changed to a black southeaster, and blew itself out, giving the ship a famous shove to the northward into the joyous sunshine of the trade. Rapid and white she ran homewards in a straight path, under a blue sky and upon the plain of a blue sea. She carried Singleton's completed wisdom, Donkin's delicate susceptibilities, and the conceited folly of us all. The hours of ineffective turmoil were forgotten. The fear and anguish of those dark moments were never mentioned in the glowing peace of fine days. Yet from that time our life seemed to start afresh, as though we had died and been resuscitated. All the first part of the voyage, the Indian Ocean on the other side of the Cape, all that was lost in a haze, like an ineradicable suspicion of some previous existence. It had ended, then there were blank hours, a livid blur, and again we lived. Singleton was possessed of sinister truth, Mr. Crichton of a damaged leg, the cook of fame, and shamefully abused the opportunities of his distinction. Donkin had an added grievance. He went about repeating with insistence, "He said he would brain me. Did you 'ear? They are going to murder us now for the least little thing." We began at last to think it was rather awful, and we were conceited. We boasted of our pluck, of our capacity for work, of our energy. We remembered honorable episodes, our devotion, our indomitable perseverance, and were proud of them as though they had been the outcome of our unaided impulses. We remembered our danger, our toil, and conveniently forgot our horrible scare. We decried our officers who had done nothing, and listened to the fascinating Donkin. His care for our rights, his disinterested concern for our dignity, were not discouraged by the invariable contumely of our words, by the disdain of our looks. Our contempt for him was unbounded, and we could not but listen with interest to that consummate artist. He told us we were good men, a bloomin' condemned lot of good men. Who thanked us? Who took any notice of our wrongs? Didn't we lead a dog's life for £2.10 a month? Did we think that miserable pay enough to compensate us for the risk to our lives and for the loss of our clothes? "We've lost every rag," he cried. He made us forget that he, at any rate, had lost nothing of his own. The younger men listened, thinking, "This 'ere Donkin's a long-headed chap, though no kind of man, anyhow." The Scandinavians were frightened at his audacities, Wamibo did not understand, and the older seamen thoughtfully nodded their heads, making the thin gold earrings glitter in the fleshy lobes of hairy ears. Severe, sunburnt faces were propped meditatively on tattooed forearms. Veined brown fists held in their knotted grip the dirty white clay of smouldering pipes. They listened, impenetrable, broad-backed, with bent shoulders and in grim silence. He talked with ardor despised and irrefutable. His picturesque and filthy loquacity flowed like a troubled stream from a poisoned source. His beady little eyes danced, glancing right and left, ever on the watch for the approach of an officer. Sometimes Mr. Baker going forward to take a look at the head sheets would roll with his uncouth gait through the sudden stillness of the men, or Mr. Crichton limped along, smooth-faced, useful, and more stern than ever, piercing our short silence with the keen glance of his clear eyes. Behind his back Donkin would begin again darting stealthy, sidelong looks. "'Ere's one of them. Some of you 'as made 'im fast that day. Much thanks ye got for it. Ain't 'e a drivin' you wuss'n ever? Let 'im slip overboard. Vy not? It would have been less trouble. Vy not?" He approached confidently, backed away with great effect, he whispered, he screamed, waved his miserable arms no thicker than pipe stems, stretched his lean neck, spluttered, squinted. In the pauses of his impassioned orations, the wind sighed quietly aloft, the calm sea, unheeded, murmured in a warning whisper along the ship's side. We abominated the creature and could not deny the luminous truth of his contentions. It was also obvious. We were indubitably good men, our deserts were great and our pay small. Through our exertions we had saved the ship and the skipper would get the credit of it. What had he done, we wanted to know. Donkin asked what he could do without us, and we could not answer. We were oppressed by the injustice of the world, surprised to perceive how long we had lived under its burden without realizing our unfortunate state, annoyed by the uneasy suspicion of our undiscerning stupidity. Donkin assured us it was all our good-heartedness, but we would not be consoled by such shallow sophistry. We were men enough to courageously admit to ourselves our intellectual shortcomings, though from that time we refrained from kicking him, tweaking his nose, or from accidentally knocking him about, which last, after we had weathered the Cape, had been rather a popular amusement. Davis ceased to talk at him provokingly about black eyes and flattened noses. Charley, much subdued since the gale, did not jeer at him. Knowles deferentially and with a crafty air propounded questions such as, "Could we all have the same grub as the mates? Could we all stop ashore till we got it? What would be the next thing to try for if we got that?" He answered readily with contemptuous certitude. He strutted with assurance in clothes that were much too big for him, as though he had tried to disguise himself. These were Jimmy's clothes, mostly, though he would accept anything from anybody, but nobody, except Jimmy, had anything to spare. His devotion to Jimmy was unbounded. He was forever dodging in the little cabin, ministering to Jimmy's wants, humoring his whims, submitting to his exacting peevishness, often laughing with him. Nothing could keep him away from the pious work of visiting the sick, especially when there was some heavy hauling to be done on deck. Mr. Baker had on 2 occasions jerked him out from there by the scruff of the neck to our inexpressible scandal. Was a sick chap to be left without attendance? Were we to be ill-used for attending a shipmate? "What?" growled Mr. Baker, turning menacingly at the mutter, and the whole half-circle like one man stepped back a pace. "Set the topmast stunsail. Away aloft, Donkin. Overhaul the gear," ordered the mate inflexibly. "Fetch the sail along. Bend the downhaul clear. Bear a hand." Then, with sail set, he would go slowly aft and stand looking at the compass for a long time, careworn, pensive, and breathing hard as if stifled by the taint of unaccountable ill will that pervaded the ship. "What's up amongst them?" he thought. "Can't make out this hanging back and growling. A good crowd, too, as they go nowadays." On deck the men exchanged bitter words, suggested by a silly exasperation against something unjust and irremediable that would not be denied, and would whisper into their ears long after Donkin had ceased speaking. Our little world went on its curved and unswerving path carrying a discontented and aspiring population. They found comfort of a gloomy kind in an interminable and conscientious analysis of their unappreciated worth, and inspired by Donkin's hopeful doctrines they dreamed enthusiastically of the time when every lonely ship would travel over a serene sea, manned by a wealthy and well-fed crew of satisfied skippers. It looked as if it would be a long passage. The southeast trades, light and unsteady, were left behind, and then, on the equator and under a low grey sky, the ship, in close heat, floated upon a smooth sea that resembled a sheet of ground glass. Thunder squalls hung on the horizon, circled round the ship, far off and growling angrily, like a troop of wild beasts afraid to charge home. The invisible sun, sweeping above the upright masts, made on the clouds a blurred stain of rayless light, and a similar patch of faded radiance kept pace with it from east to west over the unglittering level of the waters. At night, through the impenetrable darkness of earth and heaven, broad sheets of flame waved noiselessly, and for half a second the becalmed craft stood out with its masts and rigging, with every sail and every rope distinct and black in the center of a fiery outburst, like a charred ship enclosed in a globe of fire. And, again, for long hours she remained lost in a vast universe of night and silence, where gentle sighs wandering here and there like forlorn souls made the still sails flutter as in sudden fear, and the ripple of a beshrouded ocean whisper its compassion afar, in a voice mournful, immense, and faint. End of chapter 4, part 1.